Hi, I wanted to do a quick video just giving advice on how to theory craft and plan out a character in Grim Dawn. Like most things, there is no one right way to do this. I just wanted to share the way I do it in case it helps anyone else who's maybe having a little bit of a time trying to figure out how to make a character in Grim Dawn. And future me coming back and editing this together, I utterly failed at making this a quick video. I just ramble a lot. But TLDR, a few quick takeaways if you don't want to sit through the whole thing. 1, it is perfectly okay to play a build that just sounds fun to you and isn't perfectly optimized for power. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. 2, build around gear that you either have, that you can make or transmute into, or that you can guarantee you can get with target farming. And lastly, have some backup plans in case your primary build path doesn't work out the way you expected. And now back to your regularly scheduled video. As I go through this video, I'll be showing a lot of screens and captures using grimtools, which is, just an online tool for going through builds and items that are available within the game. You'll notice I have no ads when I'm using grimtools. I went ahead and supported the creator on Patreon, and if it's a tool you like, you use it a lot, and you can afford to do so, I would encourage you to do the same. Link to the grimtools build calculator, item database, and the creator's Patreon are in the description below. A little bit of a preface, I should point out that I don't really do much gameplay at all in the Crucible or the Shattered Realm. Those game modes are not for me. I'll dip my toes in them a little bit, but game modes like that tend to bore me pretty quickly, just the successive, more bigger number of waves and such. Not my cup of tea. And even in the main game, I probably play it a little abnormally, and that I usually do my most thorough run through with a character on normal difficulty, and then I do a very cursory run through an elite, and then ultimate can either be very thorough or cursory depending upon if I'm starting to get bored of the character or not. So yeah, I do my most thorough gameplay early on as the build is young and progressing, because that's the part of the game that I like best. I'm going to be walking through an example build as I do this, and I can't decide if it's a good example or a terrible example. It's terrible from the perspective of it is not well optimized, definitely not a power gamey sort of build. But what I like about it is it does show you how to force different things together that don't naturally go together, using a lot of damage conversion and stuff like that. And really the details of the build at this point don't really matter that much because there's an expansion coming out that's going to change a lot of things. So yeah, the build itself isn't the focus, it's more about talking about the methods. Occasionally I'll just work in footage of that build kind of playing in the background here. It's mostly a normal difficulty and mostly kind of extremely overleveled compared to probably what most people do in this game. I take my time and enjoy this game, so I'm not particularly concerned with, rushing to the hardest difficulty or anything like that. So I do, farming and normal difficulty and all that just to gear up a little bit sooner. So if it looks like I'm overleveled, I kind of am. And I'm okay with it. And after that extended introduction, onto the actual topic of this video. How do I make a build in Grim Dawn? So I start by asking myself kind of an existential question, and that is, am I going for an unlimited power sort of build or more of a John Burton build? I'll explain John Burton builds in a second. Unlimited power builds, though, are pretty much what they sound like. It's basically reducing the game to a math problem to achieve a specific end. So maybe you have a goal of, I want to beat this celestial or super boss on ultimate difficulty. I want to get to this level of the Shattered Realm or the Crucible or whatever the terms are in those gameplay modes. Building the most powerful character you can to make achieving that end easy. And I kind of got bored with those a long time ago. perfectly okay if you're into them, just not my cup of tea anymore. Now, John Burton, on the other hand, he is no Emperor Palpatine. He is a character in the movie Big Trouble in Little China. And if you have not seen that John Carpenter masterpiece, how dare you? You have homework. Go do that right now. Pause. Go watch the movie. Well, only pause if you're going to come back and watch the rest. But, you know, watch the movie. But old John just says, "What the hell?" It's kind of like his catchphrase in that movie. And that's kind of what John Burton builds are to me. I just get an idea in my head, and it doesn't matter if it sounds suboptimal or really have to, like, force these things together to work. Like, it might be a bunch of incongruous ideas that are held together by, you know, duct tape and hopes and dreams. It's just, what the hell? That sounds fun. I'm going to give it a try. Because that's the point to me. It's to have fun. And I tend to have more fun when I'm trying things out and experimenting rather than just, you know, solving the same math problem over and over again, just, you know, changing the damage type. So I'm going to kind of walk through an example as I do this. And this example is going to be one of those John Burton builds, where it's something that it kind of has to be, you know, shoehorned together to kind of work. But, you know, we'll do my best here as I kind of go through this. So, like, after deciding that philosophy, the next thing I do is I just come up with what is it that I want to try out. Is it like a class combination, or there skills that I want to try out, or there devotions I want to try out, you know, maybe a set or something like that. What is the thing that I want to try out in this particular build? And if you're just starting out, I'd recommend just, you know, picking a class combination that seems like it's your cup of tea. And so, like, this is my first playthrough of the game in at least 5 years. I forget exactly how many. But going back to when Grim Dawn initially launched, the first character I ever built was a Saboteur, which is a Nightblade mixed with a Demolitionist. It did not go well. You know, they by shoehorning together in those days did not work very well because I didn't really know what I was doing. And I never tried that combination again. So coming back to it for the first time in a very long time here, I wanted to give that a shot again to see if I could make it work. So, like, that's my starting point, is I want to make a Saboteur. And then there was another devotion that I wanted to try as well, which I had always wanted to use. Unknown Soldier, you basically get these up to 3 little spirit pets that kind of follow you around and do damage. And, you know, that kind of tied in with, you know, Nightblade has Blade Spirits, which are player scaling pets, and Demolitionists have a couple abilities that act as player scaling pets. And I'm like, oh, are there any other devotions that's like, oh, the Revenant, that has player scaling pets too. Huh, maybe I could make that a thing with this build. So, a Saboteur pet build is kind of what I was going for, which is a little weird. So, after kind of like that initial kind of conceptual thing that I want to try out there, then it's kind of going through the skills of both classes and seeing if there's kind of like a particular feel to the gameplay that I want to arrive at with that particular class combination. Now, a big part of feel in this game is deciding how many different things you want to do. Like, how many different skills do you want to use, how many different types of attacks. You know, you have your basic default attacks, but then you have potentially spammable skills, cooldown skills, fire and forget skills, item skills, toggle skills. How many different things do you want to be managing? And it's kind of a good idea to have a sense for what you're comfortable with controlling before you start selecting every skill under the sun and biting off more than you can chew. And one thing to bear in mind when you're making that decision is there are things that you're going to be doing that aren't just attacks. You know, there's drinking health potions, drinking mana potions, there's now dodging in the game. You may want to have keybinds for standing in place and attacking enemies from afar if you're a ranged attacker. You may want to have force move without attacking as a keybind. Figure out that, like, total amount of keybinds that I want to have is kind of an important step of, like, deciding on what skills I want. And for me, there's kind of like a sweet spot there that I was going to target with this build, which is one kind of spammable attack, 3 kind of cooldown / fire and forget attacks, and then maybe 1 or 2 other ones that are kind of more situational, so like a heal spell, mobility spell, something like that. Anything else I do, I want to be fairly passive, and, you know, not have to worry about activating it constantly. So that's like the UI management part of the feel that I decide upon, and then like there's the actual gameplay feel. How do I want that to feel when I'm actually engaging and attacking enemies? And I kind of had a weird idea for just the overall gameplay feel, which is I was playing, well, for a few hours until she got bored of it, as is the nature of that game. I was playing Vampire Survivors with my oldest daughter, and I was kind of like showing her like basic kind of build to beat like the first level or two when it works well there. And it's kind of this combination of Garlic, which is a damage aura, Santa Water, which are these huge AoE bombs, and the Dagger, which is just basically a shotgun streaming off in whatever direction you want. And, you know, kind of, as I was kind of playing that with her and showing her how to do that, it kind of, I was like, I can kind of do that as a Saboteur. Because, you know, Veil of Shadow is basically Garlic. Phantasmal Blades and, you know, Chill Spikes, which is an item skill. Those are basically the dagger there. And then the Demolitionist tree is just full of bombs that are like Santa Water, kind of going off all around there. So I would have like this fully automatic shotgun. I would have this passive AoE damage from Veil of Shadow, and, you know, carpet bomb the area with Blackwater, Cocktail, and Thermite Mines to take out large groups of enemies. And that kind of seemed like kind of a good start there. Problem is the damage types don't match up. So Veil of Shadow is doing cold resistance reduction. The demolition things are fire. So when I made that kind of like skill selection, I had to have that in the back of my head that I'm probably going to have to do some damage conversion here, where either I'm going to have to turn those demolitionist abilities from fire into cold, or I'm going to have to turn Veil of Shadow's resistance reduction from cold resistance reduction to fire or elemental resistance reduction, and, you know, change Phantasmal Blades damage types to be more fire as well. I kind of do a rough pass at filling out the skill tree there, which is going to get adjusted after figuring out gearing and plus the item bonuses and all that kind of stuff. But having that baseline of skills lets me figure out what do I need to look for in terms of gear. Note that you don't really need to go all the way up to level 50 in terms of your investment in your individual classes on the little bar at the bottom if you're not planning on using skills that are that high up. That said, you may still need to do that if you need high levels of attribute prerequisites for your gear. So you get a lot of physique, a lot of cunning, a lot of spirit, a lot of health, and those affect other things like OA and DA by leveling up that bar at the bottom. So even if you're not using skills that are all the way at the top end of one of those classes, in some cases it can be beneficial to fill those bars up if you need the attributes. And for me, I'm probably actually just going to try that out both ways. So, you know, I don't need to go all the way up to level 50 in Demolitionist. So I may try that at first, and then maybe you can refund those points at the Spirit Guide. Then I may try it, okay, maybe I'll put some of those points into some other skills and just see what feels better. Respecking is easy, and if you're not sure, is it better for me to fill out that bar, or is it that second class bar, or is it better for me to put those into skill points? You can try it both ways, and this game supports that. When you're looking at your skills, try to identify breakpoints in them as well. Not every skill needs to be overcapped all the way to, you know, plus 10 over its soft cap. An example here is Phantasmal Blades. It has a breakpoint at 24 out of 10 where it gets one last extra projectile, which is a big damage boost, but the last 2 points beyond that aren't really as important. So kind of go through your skills and kind of make sure you're stopping at kind of a breakpoint and not over investing. You know, each particular skill may have something like a plus speed or plus resistance reduction or plus cooldown reduction, if that's the main thing you're using that skill for, stop at a breakpoint and don't overinvest into it to get more, well, it's just wasting points that maybe can be allocated better somewhere else. So gearing is the next step here in the process in terms of, roughing out a plan for what I want to have. There are a couple of fundamental questions to ask early on with regards to gearing any build. And that's what sort of weapon layout are you going to be using, because there's a lot of different options there. There's kind of sword and board, sword and caster offhand. That sword can also be melee or ranged, or you can do two-handed range, two-handed melee, or dual-wielding melee, dual-wielding ranged. Lots of different options. And that kind of plays into what sort of skills you've taken. Some have prerequisites. They only work with melee, they only work with range, they only work with two-handed, etc. And what sort of devotions you'd be targeting too, because they have requirements as well. So depending upon that, the decision kind of may be made for you, depending upon what you're going for. I have a little bit of flexibility in this build here. I'm mostly going to be doing ranged attacks. It doesn't really matter what my weapon is, since I'm attacking with spells. It can be either ranged or melee. But when it comes down to like a two-handed weapon versus a one-handed weapon and a sword and an offhand, etc., I kind of want to have an offhand in this build. That's because I have a lot of cooldown skills, and caster offhands are the biggest chunk of cooldown reduction that you can get. So, I'll go with, a weapon and a caster offhand here. But what you go with depends upon what your build is actually going for. I have another build that I'm kind of twiddling with in the background that, it'll be a Vindicator sort of thing, but it has a lot of two-handed stuff. So that's probably going to be a two-handed ranged weapon build, because that's dictated by the skills that I'm choosing for that character. But it really depends on what you want to accomplish. After that, are there any other special constraints in your particular build that you need to consider for gearing? I mentioned I was going to need to do some damage conversion to kind of get this to work. So I started looking at the viability of fire versus fire to cold conversion and cold to fire conversion and seeing what worked there. And the most important thing when you're determining what kind of gear you want to use when you're theory crafting is availability. It does you no good to plan a build that requires like an entire 4-piece set of like level 94 gear that is entirely random drops when you don't have it. At the very least, if you're going to do something like that, make sure you have a recipe for one of the parts so you can transmute that one part you can craft into all the other pieces. But ideally, if you're planning out something that's based heavily on legendaries and set items, make sure you have them or you can make them. Because otherwise, if it's dependent upon those items, you just might not ever, achieve what you want to achieve. So for the particular build I was working on here, I could go fire to cold damage conversion or cold to fire damage conversion. And there was a really cool cold to fire damage conversion set that did some nice things. It made Veil of Shadow huge. And it kind of covered, it added a lot of fire resistance reduction to Veil of Shadow as well. But I didn't have it. And it did me no good to spend a lot of time planning around that when I can't even craft a piece of the set, let alone do I have like four pieces of that set hanging around in my inventory. So that kind of like settled that decision for me. Am I doing fire to cold or cold to fire? I ended up doing fire to cold because I had some of the items that I would use to go from fire to cold. I didn't have any of the cold to fire items in my stash. A little bit of an editorial comment about planning around large sets as well. I don't like it. Although a lot of people do, they kind of find it, great. I like the looks of them sometimes, and I'll use like illusions to kind of look like a set piece. For me personally, it feels like a set is the game developer telling me how to play the game that I bought, and I don't like that. I paid for it, it's my sandbox now, and I'll pee in it however I want. Sort of, that sort of thing. So I'm not a huge set guy. You know, I have like the 2-piece set of rings. Occasionally I'll do 2 pieces of a set if the early bonuses are good. I almost never do a complete like 4-piece set or more in any sort of ARPG. Just because, like I said, it's like the developers telling me how to play the game. And I don't like that. It's a role-playing game, and I want to choose my role. So that kind of made that decision for me in working on this particular character. And I should note, damage conversion isn't something you have to do. It's kind of a choice when you're making your character, and it comes with an opportunity cost. If you're doing a lot of conversion of damage types, you're giving up plus damage affixes usually, so it's not optimal, but it's fun, and this is kind of a what-the-hell build. So what I usually do when I'm planning out gear for a character is I start off with a gear set that is entirely green items, mostly monster infrequents. And there's 2 reasons for that. The monster infrequents are, if you're not familiar with those in Grim Dawn, they're basically target farmable items that have randomly generated affixes on them. So they have a base set of affixes, which can include skill modifiers that are usually a solid start, and then it tacks on a couple affixes on top of those. So that base monster infrequent item you can kind of target farm, and then you kind of need a lucky roll the dice on the prefix and suffix to get what you want to get. So what you can do in grimtools, and since we have an idea of what skills we want to use, we can go into the item database there and start looking for rare green items that have skill modifiers to the particular skills we want to use, just to see if there's anything interesting there. So you click on like the advanced item, there's a skill, scroll down till you see the skill modifiers. You select the skill you want to see modifiers for, and then you can kind of search the items and see if there's anything cool that you want to use. Similarly, if you want to do damage conversion, this is a good time to start looking for monster frequents that will convert between damage types as well. So I will usually build a form of my character that's entirely based around those, because I know I can at least farm the base item for those monster frequents. Now, never plan around both a rare suffix and prefix for a monster infrequent unless you already have it. It's very rare to even drop a double rare monster infrequent, let alone one with the exact set of affixes you want. Plan around either affixes you already have in a stash somewhere, or if you don't have one in your stash, choose like 1 magic affix and 1 rare affix. And if you want to have a good chance of those dropping, they need to kind of match the base damage type of the monster infrequent. So if it's a monster infrequent like a spectral longsword that has a lot of base cold damage, it's going to tend to drop with affixes like chilled and rime frost that are cold damage based. So you can kind of plan around those. Anything that's above and beyond those, you're if you're wanting like a fire damage spectral longsword, that's going to be a tough thing to drop. So plan around something that is kind of the same kind of base damage types as those. And then there are other generic prefixes and affixes that tend to drop fairly commonly. Things like aggressive and vigorous that add like, you know, OA or health. You can kind of plan around those a little bit too and hope that you get those. I should add that I think the expansion is going to add some level of affix rerolling. So that'll be really cool if that comes out. And that'll give you a little bit more flexibility in planning for, I guess, harder to get affixes. The other reason I plan out one of those kind of all green sets is that this game doesn't start at level 94, which is where if you're just browsing for the most powerful legendary items, they're going to be like, you know, level 84, level 90, level 94 and above, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of game before then. And you can start getting these monster infrequents as soon as you get access to the area where they drop, which can be relatively quickly in some cases. So these are kind of the items I'm going to be using probably in the early game, and potentially even in the later game if I get a really good drop on them. And if you are a new player starting out, completely empty stash, this is the most important version of your character to build, this kind of all green version. It's not literally all green. I have a couple legendaries on there, but they are target farmable legendaries, and they happen to be ones that I already have. But building around something that's entirely target farmable, it'll make you a lot less frustrated if you have a build that can work with this rather than waiting for a perfect legendary or set to drop. And also with these green items, it's okay to farm on normal. It's okay to farm in normal. It's okay to farm in normal. A lot of people, I feel like, play this game as a race to get to ultimate difficulty, to get to those level 94 items. You don't have to do that. If you want to take your time in the lower difficulties and get some good gear, you know, as long as it's not boring for you, go ahead and do that. I mean, I have a quick farming route where it's like, okay, I have 15 minutes to squeeze in a little play. Let's go do this little route to get, you know, Nabadia's horns and, you know, Gale Slice's metal, a couple other things, just to see if I get any good drops. It's perfectly okay to do that stuff in the early game and not wait until you're getting the absolute highest level version of a drop. In a lot of ways, it'll make the going smoother until you get to level 94. You don't need to worry about getting over leveled. The content scales pretty well throughout the game, and not in a annoyingly obnoxious way. But yeah, it's okay to farm this stuff at lower levels. I promise I won't tell anybody. So for this particular example here, I went with a lot of damage conversion between, you know, piercing to cold, vitality to cold, fire to cold on all these different monster frequencies, and some of them have some cool like skill modifier affixes as well for what the abilities I was going to be using. So I kind of mapped out a whole build using greens. That's kind of my aiming in this direction as I kind of go forward here. And there were a couple of cases here where I went back and looked in some of my other characters, and they already had some specific affix combinations that were good. So like my shoulder guards, I have that affix and prefix on shoulder guards somewhere in my stash, so I can plan specifically around those. Then I will build kind of the next level of the character, which is kind of more end-gamey. And I kind of go through the same process in grimtools, looking for cool items that have skill modifiers, but this time I open it up to legendaries as well as monster infrequents. Now, unlike monster infrequents, most legendaries aren't target farmable. There are a couple that are, but by and large, at this point, I'm planning around legendaries that, again, I have or that I can craft. And craftable legendaries are a huge subset here. So, like, for this particular character, you know, I mentioned that I wanted to have a little bit of, like, garlic from Vampire Survivors. So, you know, I have Veil of Shadow as, you know, one source of garlic. And then there's this piece of chest armor here, which it's not optimal. It does fire damage. I'm mostly doing cold damage. But it's another layer of garlic that's like a toggle skill on there. So I'm throwing it in there just because it seems fun. And I'll be converting the fire damage that it actually does to cold anyways. So, like, since I have that, I can plan around that. The offhand is another one like the chest piece where it's fire damage based. But it just does some things that seem cool, like it adds more thermite mines, and it adds more pets. I mentioned I kind of want some pets. Well, this automatically summons some fire pets to me. And that particular one, I didn't have that item, but I had another item from the set. I can transmute that into this offhand and be able to use that. And then the amulet was kind of one of the ones that was kind of like one of the key pieces that I stumbled into that just seems really cool, where it adds a ton of fire to cold conversion and adds another, like the offhand, adds a ton of thermite mine summons. So I'm going to have like an army of thermite mines out there that are acting as turrets once I put a devotion on them. And I didn't have that amulet, but I had the recipe, so I can craft it. So, again, building around stuff that I have or that I can make. So, all the gear that's on this particular build here, it's a build for me, not for you. And what I mean by that is all the gear that I have here, I have. in my stashes. I either found the item, I found the recipe for it so I can make it, or I have another item of a set that it's in and I can transmute into it. The commonly found monster infrequents I can farm, or I already have them. The less commonly found monster infrequents, like the rings there, they're really hard to get. I farmed them years ago, and they're just gathering dust in my stash, and I can use them. And philosophically, that's an important thing to understand in Grim Dawn builds. I'm not someone who posts builds really, because they're based on what I have, which is not necessarily what you have. So I tend to play the things that I can play because I have access to those items, if that makes sense. I just think that that's kind of a fundamental important thing to understand when you're making a build in Grim Dawn. You're usually making it for you. And it's not necessarily something that's readily shareable or that someone else can do because they may not have that stuff. Even when I do the loadout that is entirely legendary items, I usually like to treat at least 2 or 3 of the slots as degrees of freedom. And what I mean by that is I don't want to have every piece as a must-have make or break the build item. You want to have some flexibility in some of the pieces where it's like, okay, I got all the items I want, but this resistance rolled crap on all these things, so now all I need is a pair of boots that shores up that resistance, you know. Have a couple of slots that give you that flexibility. So in this build, I don't really care about my boots. My boots are going to be whatever I need to round out my resistances or shore up something else. Similarly, it's also handy to keep 1 or 2 monster infrequent items in your final legendary build, just because you can farm affixes on those items, again, to shore up weaknesses. So next up on the gearing side is I do a preliminary look at components and augments, particularly the ones that add skills to my gear. I'm not going to go through and add all the components and augments just yet. I kind of save a lot of that for the very last step to round out resistances. But I do take a look at the ones that are going to add skills that I want. In particular, on my main hand weapon, I wanted, you know, a spammable weapon skill that was kind of like a shotgun, like infinite ray of daggers. Now I could either do that on the skill side of things where I can make phantasmal blades constantly firing. But there's also an item, I know, Seal of the Night, that gives you this chill spikes thing, which is very similar to phantasmal blades. So I can have that as my spammable version, and then use the stronger phantasmal blades on cooldown as well. So I have 2 versions of that kind of shotgun, so spam one when the other one comes off cooldown, use that. Then on my other offhand, more garlic. Seal of Blades is like a swirling kind of area passive effect damage thing. So it's like a 3rd layer of garlic that I can tack on top of the chest piece and Veil of Shadow, and I can convert its damage type to cold as well, so that'll be doing a lot there. Then on metals, you have the options to use an augment on those to add a mobility skill, and I just picked a random teleport one here, just because teleports are nice as kind of escapability things. And once I kind of have that first pass done on all my gear, then I go back into my skills, see where, depending upon all the different plus to individual skills and plus skills in all classes ended up, massage the skill allocation back on the tree there to get to where I want it to be, you know. Making sure things aren't overdone, they aren't overcapped, making sure that I'm stopping at a break point at a particular skills. Just kind of like making sure everything's kind of like, you know, optimum's too strong a word, but make sure it feels nice and that I have a good amount distributed in the different abilities I want there. Next up is planning devotion. And my main advice, if you're planning devotion, is don't fall in love with tier 3s. So there are different level of tier constellations you can get. Tier 1 constellations typically only require 1 point of affinity before you can unlock them. Tier 2 have slightly higher levels of affinity requirements before you can use them. Tier 3 have very high levels of requirements and provide no affinity reward when you complete them. when you're starting out the game, those tier 3s may seem very tempting. But maybe just pick one, maybe two to kind of go for if they're kind of very similar in terms of affinity requirements. It's kind of a little bit of a trap, in my opinion, to focus all your efforts on getting to a few tier 3s and overlook all the good stuff on the way, because there really are a lot of good tier 1 and tier 2 devotions. And if you're solely focused on efficiently getting affinities to get to those tier 3 constellations, you're probably going to miss out on some really good stuff. And that isn't to say that all tier 3s are bad. There are obviously some very good ones out there, you know. Some that can be like very like game breaking or build defining, you know. Used to use Aeon's Hourglass all the time for its cooldown reduction on Arcanist, that's it. To, you know, bring down like Mirror of Arakti's cooldowns and stuff like that. There are great tier 3 options. Just if you're going in that direction, kind of be a little bit focused and don't try to get like 17 of them. I mean, it's okay to have tier 3 devotions. It's also okay to not have any. You know, the other build I'm working on, which is a Vindicator, I'm not planning on taking any tier 3s, and that's fine too. And as you're kind of working towards the affinity requirements for all those things, try and use that as an opportunity to round out your resistances, your OA, your DA, kind of look what's lacking on your character sheet, and kind of try to take paths that kind of round out those weak points in your character as you go and build out your devotion path. When you have the ones you want to achieve kind of picked out. Take a path that will not just get you to those, but get you to those in a manner that, you know, rounds out your resistances and shores up your other weaknesses, be it OA, DA, health, whatever. And remember, there is a search function right there where you can look up different types of things that are on there. If you're looking for a specific resistance type, a specific damage type, you know, attack damage converted to health, whatever it is you're looking for, you can search for that both in-game and on grimtools to find the types of nodes you want to get. And it's important to note that devotion is very easy to respec, both at the spirit guide and via potions that completely reset all of your devotion trees. So try things out, and if they don't work, you can change it easily. So for this particular build, there was that one tier 3 devotion I wanted to try. I had never tried it. I wanted to give it a shot, that Unknown Soldier one. So that was going to be kind of like one that I had locked in as something I wanted to use. Now beyond that, there's a little bit of planning you can do in terms of how many attack devotions you want to have. And the thing with those is on-attack devotions need to be linked to an attack ability. And they can't all go on everything. Some can't go on pets. So like I have... one of my pets that I have in this build is Blade Spirit. Not everything can go on Blade Spirit, so I can't use Blade Spirits to summon those unknown soldiers as an example. But when you count up the number of attack spells you have, including pets, you're not going to be able to take more attack devotions than that, or you're not going to be able to map them to everything. In addition, don't overlook defensive devotions. Those are, in a lot of ways, as important as offensive ones, in some cases. For some builds, probably more important. And from a personal preference side of things, devotions that just do damage have always underwhelmed me. I much prefer looking at devotions that do resistance reduction, that's going to stack with resistance reduction forms that I already use, as well as applying debuffs that affect bosses. So things like freezes and stuns, a lot of higher end bosses are immune to those. Things like OA and DA reduction sound boring, but they affect bosses, as does impaired aim and fumble. So like on this particular build, I have, as a tier 1 constellation I'm using here, I have Tsunami, which I have bound to the 7,000 thermite mines that I'm going to be throwing out there. The damage isn't going to be great because the thermite mines don't have weapon damage, but they are going to be proccing that impaired aim quite a bit to debuff bosses. And because there's just so many of them thrown out, they'll be doing pretty good damage as well, basically turning all those thermite mines into turrets. I mentioned resistance reduction as kind of an important thing to look at when you're kind of scanning through the devotion tree here. And there are multiple forms of it, so The wording kind of changes depending upon what type of resistance reduction it is. So the minus XX percentage resistance reduction, like you see on Rumor, that stacks with that same exact wording of resistance reduction. So like what I have on Veil of Shadow and Thermite Mines, that will stack with those, which makes that kind of the most, I would say, valuable form of resistance reduction, that exact wording. Then you have a flat number reduced targets resistances, which you'll see on things like Elemental Storm and the Revenant, as well as on one of the modifiers for Blackwater Cocktail. Those don't stack. Only the highest version of those, that's the most recently applied highest version, will stack. So you don't need to take too many of those, just pick one. And lastly is the crappiest version of resistance reduction, which you'll see on the Viper. It is a percent of their current resistance that it kind of reduces by. Doesn't stack, is modified by weapon damage, but not above 100%. And basically, if you've already reduced someone's resistances close to 0, it doesn't do a whole lot. So if someone has 5% cold resistance, this will reduce them 20% of that from 5% to 4%. It's not great. Now, if you got someone to minus 100% resistances, well, then they'll get to minus 120, and it's more significant. But it's kind of situational, in which cases it's good, kind of skippable. So, for this particular character, I actually built it out in two different ways. One where I was taking Elemental Storm as that kind of second form of resistance reduction. The other one where I was doing it with the Revenant. And, honestly, I'm going to try both out. The Revenant I will probably end up going with, just because, as I said in the introduction, I kind of want to have some pets. I don't do many pet builds. And that gets me more pets, and those pets will be doing the resistance reduction. So I kind of have two different plans, and the actual one I end up going with will depend on the actual gameplay and how it feels, but probably going to go in that Revenant direction. Now, after kind of going through and doing Devotion, that's kind of rounded out a lot of my resistances, as well as provide bonuses to attributes. Now I go back and I look at my gear, and for the gear that I want to use, I look at the prerequisites on it. Grim Tools will let you equip gear that you don't meet the prerequisites for, and that doesn't actually work in-game. So at this point, I kind of circle back and I start polishing off my attributes, bringing them up to the levels I need to equip gear, bearing in mind that I may have some affixes or constellations that reduce the requirements for some of those items. And if I don't meet the prerequisites for all my gear, I may have to shuffle things around. I may have to invest more into, the class bar at the bottom of the skill tree for one of the classes, something like that. Or shuffle my devotion to get more physique or whatever. Or aim for affixes on monster infrequents that get me more physique, more cunning, more spirit, whatever. And lastly is going back to the gear tab, and assigning components and augments to all the items that I have equipped. Augments are usually going to be how you round out your resistances. Make sure when you're in Grim Tools you have the settings set so that it is displaying the resistances on ultimate difficulty. You want to make sure that that is set so you're not under-aiming on your resistances. But ideally you want them to be a little bit overcapped. I think there's a little bit of resistance reduction in the game. For my particular character, I have +3 to all max resistances from one of my items, and then when Blast Shield goes off, and I have another +5. So I want at least 88 resistances in everything on ultimate difficulty, preferably a fair bit of margin on top of that. And if you're targeting a super boss or something that has a lot of resistance reduction, if that's the goal, you can change your resistances specifically for that fight by changing your augments. Now, ideally, by the time I'm done putting all my augments on, I'm pretty close to maxed out on all my resistances. And the reason for that, why I want to be maxed out there, is because components are a lot more interesting than augments. and you may want to get an interesting component and not have to worry about, oh, but I can't take it because I have to max out my poison resistance. So hopefully by the time you got your augments done, you're pretty close to maxed out with all your resistances, so you can have more fun when you select your components. Now, augments, when you're doing your theory crafting around augments, note that they are faction aligned, and you can't get all the factions in a single playthrough, or at least a single playthrough of a single difficulty level. So you have Kaimon's Chosen or the Order of Death's Visual. You're one or the other on those. Similarly with the various cults of Soleil, Bismael, and Drieg, you only get one of those per difficulty level. And then Barrowholm, you're either allied with them or you're their enemies. So for me, as an example, in my Monster Infrequent gear, I have a helm that I have to kill a Barrowholm person for. So I can't ally with them and get those augments. So I can't plan to use the Barrowholm augments if I'm going to farm and get that helmet that I might be getting. Now, that's only true for each kind of difficulty setting. So usually the workaround for that would be I would farm the helm in normal and ultimate, but then I might, if I want a Barrowholm augment, I might ally myself with them in the elite run through. And that way, at least give myself the option for the augments. Same thing for the cult augments. So I might join Cult of Soleil in normal, Cult of Drieg in elite, Cult of Bismael in ultimate. Plan it out a little bit just to make sure you're not missing out on augments that you think you need. Components are a little bit more interesting than augments, generally speaking. Some of them have cool abilities that they add. Some of them will add OA, DA, and other things in addition to resistances. Attack damage converted to health, projectile avoidance, stuff like that. So this particular character, for example, has a good base in projectile avoidance from Shadow Dance on the Nightblade tree and Blast Shield when that goes off on the Demolitionist tree. So I made sure to lean into that a little bit and put like a ballistic armor component on my chest piece, which gives me even more projectile avoidance. And when Blast Shield goes off, I'll have 100% projectile avoidance, which is pretty nice. Similarly with my spammable attack and chill spikes and phantasmal blades doing weapon damage, attack damage converted to health is great. So I put a component that does that on the handpiece because health restoration in most ARPGs is pretty important. So figure out if there are any components that look like they add cool things that you really want to add in your build, and add those in first, and then use the last ones for shoring up weak spots, be it resistances to boost your OA, DA, health, whatever. And if you're running through the game and you're not seeing a particular component that you want, you're like, why isn't this thing ever dropping? Remember that a lot of them are craftable. So you go to the blacksmith and he'll have a menu of components and, make this rare component from these common components and then make this super rare component from all these other rare components that you crafted. It's kind of a cool system. And it lets you, round out your character a lot more. They're a lot more satisfying than augments, is I guess the way I would put it. Augments are kind of boring. Components are kind of cool. And when I've built my character and gone through all this and have it complete, then I'll do variants. So I've run into it a lot where I have an idea in my head and I get to a certain point in the game and it doesn't work. Either because just the idea was shit, or I got crappy affixes on everything and things just don't work out. So in this particular build here, like the glaring weakness, I mentioned there were a lot of items where I was skipping over cold damage. That also applies to the devotion tree. I wasn't taking a lot of cold damage affixes for someone who's fundamentally building cold damage. That's kind of a bad idea, but I'm trying it out anyways. What the hell sort of philosophy kind of going on here? But it may be that my damage just ends up being terrible in ultimate because my cold damage multiplier is so low. Now, it might also be fine because I have so many more damage sources than I normally have that maybe it's offsetting that to a certain extent. Fingers crossed. But it might not work out. And That's where variants come in. So I always build up alternates for my gear out and for my devotion tree, where I try to say, okay, if this main plan doesn't work out, am I easily able to get to something else that maybe I can try and that's a little bit different? So as an example on the devotion side, I can, if those summon skeletons don't work out, well, that's my source of resistance reduction. Well, I can drop those and maybe swing down into the corner of the devotion map where there's elemental storm as resistance reduction, and there's other forms of elemental damage down there. So I can swing down there to build up my cold damage instead of going for those summon skeletons up there. Similarly, if, I have all these weird items in there that are like adding fire damage, I will plan out, okay, what's the more boring cold damage version of my chest piece, my offhand, stuff like that. Plan out those variants and say, okay, if my main plan is too crazy, what else could work? And hopefully, again, it's stuff that I have in my stash and it's not too big of a pain in the butt to get there. That way, it's like I don't get, tens of hours into a playthrough and get super frustrated. I can just switch to something else that's maybe a little less disappointing and less frustrating. But ultimately, you can only spend too long twiddling in these things when you really should go in and start playing the game. So even the process of building this character here, which again, not a super powerful, not super optimized, anything like that. Even looking at it, it's like I'm not happy with the OA and DA, and I wish they were higher. But that's the sort of thing I can take care of with actually playing the game. I have a couple of monster infrequent slots. Maybe I can find those drops instead of what's in my inventory. Maybe I find those with better OA and DA numbers than what I built in here. Who knows? Don't spend all your time theory crafting. Get in there and actually play the game and enjoy it. So that's kind of my rambling example, kind of going through this process here, So set a goal. Is it for power or fun? And then decide what you want to kind of accomplish within that kind of scope. So, I wanted to make a Saboteur that had pets. So, I built out something that's got, the Unknown Soldier, it's got the Revenant, it's got Blade Spirit, and it's offhand also summons some pets as well. Then I wanted some Vampire Survivor-like abilities, so I wanted Garlic, so I've got Veil of Shadow stacking with Phoenix Fire, stacking with a Suit of Armor with a Garlic effect, and a Seal of Blades with a Garlic effect, and a lot of those damage types will all be converted to cold to stack with my resistance reduction. I wanted to blanket the area with giant Santa Water-like bombs. I've got Blackwater Cocktail, the cooldown version of that, and I think I'll be able to throw out 19 Thermite Mines, just throwing out a huge swath of resistance reduction and damage there. And then for that shotgunning stream of daggers, I'll have the combination of Chill Spikes and Phantasmal Blades to kind of cover that. Is it going to be powerful? Probably not. But at the beginning, I had that goal of, I don't care. This sounds fun. I want to try it out. What the hell, as John Burton says. So I've tried to record this multiple times. Every single time, I've failed at being concise. It's just really a hard topic for me to be concise about. So this ended up being more long and rambling than I intended. But anyways, hopefully this is helpful to people if they're starting out in Grim Dawn, or maybe it's getting their interest a little piqued with the expansion around the corner. My advice, focus on having fun with your builds. Don't worry so much about perfectly min-maxing and optimizing, unless the Shattered Realm's your thing, in which case I am not the right person to give advice. But you can build very different types of characters that feel very different in this game. And that tends to be the satisfying thing about it to me. You can make a lot of different things work in this game. There's a lot of variety in monster infrequence and damage conversion, and lots of different ways to shoehorn different types of characters together in a way that's kind of fun and enjoyable. So I hope that helped. Like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff if you enjoy this sort of content. And let me know your thoughts or suggestions in the comments below. Thanks for listening.